Thank you, David. It's more than an honor to be here, to be acknowledged, and also to share the stage with the Oshers. Barney and I are both New Englanders, probably Reformed Red Sox fans, and Barbara knows that I'm really Adam's son, that my grandfather came to this country from Sweden, and I'm named after him. His name was Jan Adamsson. It has nothing to do with the president, the guy with the wig. So I was asked to make a few comments, and I want you to indulge me a bit because some of it's going to be a little stroll down memory lane, but I guarantee that I'll give a proper commencement ending. I'm sore. With a lyrical aria at the end. The first time I ever heard mention of an institution called the San Francisco Conservatory of Music was sometime in 1971. And yes, that was a long time ago. I'm even afraid to do the math. But I suspect it's nearly a half century ago. At the time, I was living in a small apartment on Telegraph Avenue in Berkeley, and I was getting free rent there in exchange for being the building's assistant manager. That was a job I fulfilled during the evening, and during the day, I worked in a warehouse on the Oakland waterfront with the grandiose name of Regal Apparel. After a full year of emptying shipping containers and of dry goods during the day and dealing with broken plumbing and blown electrical fuses in the evening, I was on the verge of returning to the East Coast when I got a call from a composer friend of mine who told me about a potential job opening at a music school located, and I'm not making this up, in a former home for unwed mothers located in the wilds of San Francisco's Sunset District. The news was pretty exciting to me because I was not looking forward to going back to the East Coast and resuming the slow, grinding task of doing what a young composer did in those days, which was to follow the usual route of becoming a composer of serious, and I mean very, very serious contemporary music. I'd come out to San Francisco sort of on a lark, inspired by Jack Kerouac and Neil Cassidy, on the road, headed for North Beach and Big Sur and listening to Charlie Parker, except that I did it in a Volkswagen Beetle, which kept breaking down. And by 1971, we were no longer listening to bebop, but rather to Marvin Gaye and the Jackson 5. So I called and I asked for a job interview with the president, Milton Salkin, and his current dean. But the morning of my interview, I crashed into a post at the Oakland warehouse, and I broke my only pair of glasses. So I arrived for my job interview at the San Francisco Conservatory with a huge piece of gaffer's tape holding my glasses together. I looked marginally as ridiculous as I do right now. Somehow I was able to convince Milton Salkin that I, a 24-year-old graduate school dropout and an assistant building manager who was currently hoisting boxes in cheap apparel in an Oakland warehouse, was his best bet to fill a vacant faculty position. Milton was looking for a bargain. And I think he got one with me because he ended up teaching and coaching. I ended up teaching and coaching and conducting and producing concerts and pretty much spending nearly every available hour of my life at the school for the next 10 years. I consider those years as truly formative for me. In many ways, they constituted a real musical education that had only started in my previous years as a student. Not long ago, I read John Eliot Gardner's book about J.S. Bach called Music in the Castle of Heaven, and I was amused by the description of the chaos of Bach's in his daily life. Even during his great years when he was cantors at the Thomaskirche in Leipzig, the number of things he had to do: teach Latin, supervise the student curriculum, dole out disciplined and misbehaving boys, fix a broken organ pipe, compose a cantata for next Sunday's Lent service, invent some exercises for a beginning keyboard student, rehearse the choir, play at a funeral or a christening. Well, for 10 years that I taught at the Conservatory, my life at the corner of 19th and Ortega, although it didn't produce the Mass in B minor or the Brandenburg concertos, was nonetheless nearly as varied. I was given an office. I'd say office is a grandiose term for what it was. It was in fact a cloak closet for what had been a little chapel in the building. It literally was a closet with one door opening out to an empty lot, which in December the school's ever creative business manager rented out to a Christmas tree dealer. The electronic music studio was stuffed into a claustrophobic space under the eaves where the roof leaked during the rainy season and caused the circuits on the tape recorders and the school's Buchla synthesizer to short out. I recall vividly my first year of teaching. I created a course called Composition Workshop, in which we studied model examples like a Haydn minuet, a Mozart rondo, maybe a Schubert song, a Debussy prelude, and then tried to compose our own in those particular styles. Or another course called New Music Seminar, for which the administration had encouraged me to explain avant-garde music to the students. Imagine that. A conservatory that in 1972 considered John Cage on par with First Species Counterpoint. Pretty radical. I also taught a course in music analysis to a small number of graduate students, many of whom were struggling just to learn English and had to put up with my droning on and on and on about whatever happened to be on my mind that week. Not necessarily music, maybe Thomas Mann or Tolstoy or Wozzeck or late Beethoven quartets. In truth, I don't think I was really a very good teacher because I was so young and frankly quite clueless about the very different needs each of these students brought with them. Over the course of the following years, I became fascinated by electronic music. Those were in the days before digital technology, so it was the wild and woolly era of guerrilla electronics. That's G-U-E, guerrilla. I decided to build my own synthesizer, and I got so absorbed with the task that my office looked like an e-waste dump, with transistors and circuit chips and wires and voltage meters littering every square inch. I had no gift whatsoever for engineering, but I could follow a schematic diagram. And I did, in fact, emerge with a homemade synthesizer that was very large and had a lot of unpredictable circuits and winking lights and made a noise that was capable of offending even the most ardently devoted fan of experimental music. For 10 years, I conducted the New Music Ensemble, and we did 4 concerts a year, some of them at the Museum of Modern Art, some at the Legion of Honor, and elsewhere in the city, even in the San Francisco Hall of Flowers. I even had a clarinet student until he realized that I never picked up my instrument between lessons. My students and I were left to our own devices when it came to promoting our new concerts. With one very resourceful composition student, we discovered that in the basement there was an old offset machine, and we fixed it and figured out how it worked, and I ended up designing and printing the posters for our new music concerts, then would pile into an old VW van and drive around San Francisco stapling our homemade posters to walls and telephone poles. Next Friday, excitement, San Francisco Conservatory of Music, New Music Ensemble, plays Stockhausen, $10. The amazing fact is that these concerts, performed entirely by students, were reviewed regularly. not only by the San Francisco Chronicle, but by the San Francisco Examiner and even the Oakland Tribune. Astonishing but true, avant-garde music, San Francisco style, was a big thing back then, and the newspapers apparently felt that what we did, even though they were students performing, was worth covering. I don't mean to imply that what the critics wrote were necessarily glowing, far from it. In fact, I did get some doozers. One critic from the Chronicle, I am sure absolutely loved reviewing our concerts because it gave him a chance to empty his thesaurus of deliciously wicked adjectives in one fell swoop. Let me think of some of those favorite put-downs, many of them richly deserved. Simplistic finger painting. This one has to come with a Lewis Black. Aleatoric mumbo jumbo. I clearly recall in a review of one especially tedious piece of amplified improvisation that the critic referred to it as 40 minutes of cruel and pitiless eardrum death. And then, of course, a few years later, there was mindless, minimalist patter. You're going to hear some of that when Sarah plays. But that may have been after the premiere of my piece Shaker Loops, which happened at Hellman Hall, believe it or not. I was outraged at the time, but in retrospect, it all seems sort of fun. And the fact that the papers covered these events and not just Seijio's Hour or what was going on at the Opera House, that was really impressive. I have no doubt that it even helped in toughening my hide for later life. It is our lot as composers to routinely take the sort of drubbings that are never visited on our predecessors, the great composers. As Samuel Johnson, writing about Shakespeare, wryly observes, the great contention of criticism is to find faults in the moderns and beauties in the ancients. While an author, or I could say a composer, is yet living, we estimate his powers by his worst performance, and when he's dead, we rate him by his best. What was of such great value to me in my years at the Conservatory were two things. The first, that I was forced, or better, I should say, I was enabled to be creative in everything I undertook, whether it was programming a concert, imagining a curriculum, printing my own posters, or building my own synthesizer. The spirit of adventure and improvisation was palpable then, although the results were very often not equal to what was promised. I had my first real exposure to Wagner and to Stravinsky, not by writing a thesis for a PhD degree, but by conducting the Conservatory Orchestra in the Prelude and Liebestod to Tristan and in Petrushka. I came into contact with Steve Reich by performing a piece of his with our students. First time he ever allowed a work to be done outside of his ensemble. The other great gift that I received from the Conservatory was my fellowship with my colleagues. I learned more from them than I ever could have from a PhD program back east. Nothing could ever take the place of the experience of simply walking down the Conservatory hallway and having one or another of my teacher colleagues open a door, grab me by the arm, and pull me in to listen to a phrase of music. A Chopin ballade, a Rachmaninoff etude, a Scott Joplin rag, whatever. My apprenticeship as a composer took place during a time when contemporary music was at its grimmest, at its most cerebral. Most American composers were university professors. Most couldn't hope to survive economically from the music they were writing. And many viewed their activity as analogous to scientists or mathematicians. It was a period of pushing the boundaries of the elements of music to the extreme, whether it was by means of what could be highly organized serial systems like those of Milton Babbitt, or on the other end, highly organized aleatoric or chance procedures like those of John Cage. As a young student composer, I found myself for a while in a state of existential crisis, thinking that my only choice, if I could hope to be a serious composer, was to choose one or the other. Then it gradually dawned on me that Cage was no less intellectual and locked into his methodological thinking than the serialists were. It took me time to come to the most important understanding about music, and that is that music is above and beyond everything else, the act of communicating feeling. Music can give us intellectual pleasures, and for sure it can stimulate our sensory faculties. But the one power it has that triumphs over all the other art forms is that of feeling, of direct, immediate conveyance of emotion. Neurobiology and psychoacoustics provide tomes of data and explanations of this phenomenon, but we musicians just know it in our gut. That is why apparently no human can live without it. It's as essential for our survival as food, clothing, and shelter. Those of us who were born fortunate enough to become musicians understand that it's a lifetime of devotion. When people say of some complicated intellectual endeavor that such and such is rocket science or grandmaster chess or brain surgery, they don't know the half of it. Learning to be a musician is for certain at the peak of human achievement. It means a lifetime of devotion. For us, it's an obsession. It's an itch that we have to scratch on an hourly basis. We know it, all of us here in this room. You start when you're 3 or 4 years old, and you never have a day when you're not thinking about it and not doing it. You probably not get rich from it, not unless you manage to get a job programming Pro Tools for Jay-Z and Beyonce. It can't compete with finance or tech for monetary gain. And for those of us who want to have a life in classical music, we'll have to learn to do it in the context of a society that is mostly aware only of pop culture, and that even assumes that classical music is dying or is dead or irrelevant. How wrong they are. For us, music is not a profession, it's a life. But it's a life with real meaning. And in this current era of constantly distracting data, with our attention hijacked and our concentration seduced and scattered, to do something that requires stubborn effort and sustained focus, something that has genuine meaning and that forges a real, not a virtual, bridge between ourselves and others, something that makes us feel at the deepest levels of our being, that's a privilege. It's a privilege that only us lucky ones who have the gift of being musicians can enjoy and be thankful for. Thank you.